If I may, I would like to get the ball rolling on the question of the stadium. Chief Minister, if the mountain of rubble on this side is valued at £30 million, what is the value of the prime land at Europa Point? And are you prepared to give away that public land at Europa Point to the GFA for free, or would you expect them to repay it over a period of time?
Joe, thank you for that, which is really the most topical issue in Gibraltar today. I think most people are talking about the stadium and the issues that it entails, whether it's location, look, etc. The land that you're talking about on the east side of Gibraltar, the Rubble Mountain, and I'll always remember that in the days of the first GSLP administration, the GSD in opposition used to call that a rat-infested pile of waste grounds, and no sooner were they elected that they used to call it Sovereign Bay, then Cape Vantage. The valuation that we have in respect of property in that area is in excess of £5,000 per square metre. It's an area which is now ready for development and is Gibraltar's real high-value property lung. The area at Europa Point, which is presently really the area of the cricket ground that we're talking about, just to be clear, the area, for example, of the lighthouse, the small roundabout there, the gun emplacement and embrasure, the children's park, all of that remains. We're really talking about the cricket ground and the area in front of that. That has a valuation in the government's books of approximately £11 million. What the government is going to do in respect of that land, subject to the DPC approving plans in that area, is to make a grant of the land to the GFA. Now, this is not unusual. This is the way that government would behave with most other sporting associations, where you're dealing with exclusively sporting use. So we will make a grant of the land to the GFA as long as it is only for sporting use. So the GFA could not make other use of that land, and if they were in the future to make other use, they would have to pay a premium to the government, or the land would have to return to the government. But there are many boundaries yet in the way of the development of that stadium in that area. There is a process to be gone through, including the DPC process, which is the usual process. And of course, there are not yet leases in place in respect of it, because the GFA, of course, wants to ensure that they get DPC consent before they build. I think it's important that we also understand what the GFA have done. And I said this on television the other night, and I've said it in Parliament. I think the GFA have done one thing which is absolutely right, which is ask the community for feedback before they've made their formal applications to the DPC. We don't yet know whether the GFA is going to change its application before it goes to the DPC, or whether the DPC is going to ask them to change their application in some way. Some people have thought that the GFA have presented Gibraltar with a fait accompli of what the stadium is going to look like. And that is not what the GFA have said. The presentation that they made to the general public when I was present was to say, these are the initial ideas, please come back to us and tell us what you like and what you don't like. A lot of people have been vociferous in respect of what they don't like about the look of the stadium, some about the location of the stadium. I think it's absolutely right that the community should be having its say about this. I myself described the stadium as a spaceship from a particular science fiction saga. And I think there will be a lot of opinions now, and the formal process which commences at the beginning of next month with the DPC, I think, will no doubt produce a better result in the end, as has been the case in respect of other projects. For example, you saw the Marriott Hotel kicked back by the DPC and turned into a better project as a result. People have to take advantage now of the open meetings of the DPC, of their right to make representations at the DPC level, to have their voices heard there. This is something which we introduced after the last election. Instances like this are the opportunity for people to use those opportunities and those tools that we've given them to influence how Gibraltar will look in the future.
I think, Stephen, you want a supplementary there? Or does Joe, sorry, before you carry on, Joe, do you want a supplementary to this?
No.
Okay.
We'll have another question.
You'll go back. Okay.
On the stadium, I think that it's fair to say, Chief Minister, that although many people are, as you say, objecting to the look of the original plans, I think it's also fair to say that the majority of people are against the location rather than the look of the place.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you about something that you said in your election manifesto last time round. You said, and I'm quoting from it, that you would provide facilities for the playing, teaching and development of cricket and rugby at Europa Points. It actually specifies. Are you still committed to that, given that you are supporting the location of the stadium up there?
We are fully committed to that, except for the issue related to location. Because, of course, if you have a UEFA football stadium in the area, you can no longer have those facilities as required for rugby and for cricket. One of the things we're talking to rugby and cricket about is where they could go instead of that area, and we have very advanced plans which are not yet agreed as to where they would go. You have to understand that there is, between our election and today, there is a new moment, which is the moment that Gibraltar enters UEFA, and the vice president of UEFA visits Gibraltar on a number of occasions and scouts around Gibraltar with GFA representatives and representatives of the government of Gibraltar to find a location where we might be able to fit the stadium. Of course, until that happened, we weren't able to reach an understanding with UEFA of where they wanted that stadium to be, and therefore that particular manifesto commitment will of course be honoured, but not as to location.
Dominic Searle, I think you want to
Well,
put
just
in a
that
question.
a lot of people who, whatever the value of that land, wouldn't want any development there particularly because it's really seen as a sort of area of a little bit of space now. Would you say that people who are being critical of the siting being disloyal, because that's an element coming through, and I would have thought that that's a bit unfair. I mean, if people don't like the idea of it being there.
No, I would not say that people are being disloyal because they have a view about a particular planning application. I mean, I don't think you could get anywhere further away from loyalty or disloyalty than actually wanting to influence things in order to improve them. So I think people wanting to become involved about either location or look or aspect of the stadium are perfectly entitled to do so, and it doesn't make them more or less loyal. But what I would say...
There isn't much choice, is the point. Because
But
if you say not there...
This is the point. What I would say is that there is an issue with space and alternatives, and we don't have that many alternatives. In fact, the advice I have is that we have no alternatives which have all of the characteristics that we're talking about. I've been following, of course, Panorama's attempts to see whether it might be possible to find other locations, and very helpful artist impressions that show how it might fit in terms of mass in the area, for example, of the existing Victoria Stadium. But it's not just mass that's the issue. There are many other considerations. The advice that we had in government was that in order to give this the orientation and the access required, the Tercentenary Hall would have to, in part or in whole, be demolished. And that would, of course, mean undoing something that's been very recently built. We're talking about an area which is very close to the schools and which is presently multi-use for all sports. And all the schools access that area. So the new facility would not be multi-use. It would be exclusively football and could not be used by schools, etc. It would only be available to the national squad. So lots of issues here. It's sometimes very difficult as Chief Minister to make a decision on something like this, which is not going to be unpopular with some people. I mean, you have a lot of people, for example, clamoring for residential facilities for the elderly, and a lot of people who now see that that facility is going to be sited next to a school, being quite concerned about the building process and having a building there. Look, that issue, for example, went to planning a year and a half ago, and people have the opportunity of making their points known at the planning stage. That's why I think people should make their views known at the planning level in respect of the stadium on every aspect of what that stadium means. And none of them would be considered by me to be disloyal for doing so.
But Chief Minister, could I just cut in quickly, because we're still on the question of the statement of the stadium, if I may. Isn't the proper choice here not so much between whether we build it up there or we build it somewhere else, because there isn't, as you say, the space in Gibraltar for us to be very picky. Isn't the proper choice between whether we have the stadium now or whether we wait for the right venue to be available? I mean, we know that there are places like, small places like Andorra who have been playing their international matches at home, sometimes away. They haven't got a Category 4 stadium, and they've managed perfectly well for many years. Surely we should be walking before we run, don't you think?
Well, I think we have to run with the ball on this one, Stephen, to tell you the truth. And I think that Gibraltar has to be a bit more ambitious than others have been. If it is possible for us to have this facility built in a relatively short period of time, I know that GFA has its own particular deadlines in mind, But those are up to the GFA. They may or may not be able to deliver. The planning process may or may not allow them to deliver in time. Then the absence of a plot should not get in the way. If, look, the likelihood is anyway that there is not going to be another usable plot other than that in the future. You quoted from my manifesto. The GSD manifesto also envisaged a development in that area. Look, it was also going to be playing fields. It just didn't have the stadium sides. I don't like the stadium sides that this particular proposed stadium has at the moment. It may be that when we come out of the planning process, if the aspect of the stadium is different and the look of the stadium is different and is more in keeping with what we might want to see there, a lot of people who today are against the location might say, well, look, I was against the location of that particularly angular development there, but I've seen a new development come out of the process which the DPC has been leading on, and I actually think that this is more in keeping with what could work in the area. This is a process. Let's see where we are at the end of it, and let's not prejudge where we might be.
Chris, we need to round up on the stadium. So is it on the stadium?
About the stadium. Can Gibraltar really afford the space to give it to a stadium that will be solely for the use for the national side for Gibraltar?
Well, I think the obvious answer is yes, and I'll tell you why, in my view, it's obvious. Because we're also going to have a facility exclusively for rugby, we're also going to have a facility exclusively for cricket, and this is the way that Gibraltar is developing. Gibraltar is growing. We're growing through reclamation, we're growing economically, we're growing socially, and we're growing in sporting terms too. And the challenge has always been to run this small nation on 2.5 miles by 1 mile as if we were France, Spain, Germany, or the UK. We generate our own electricity, we produce our own water, we do all sorts of things that we would not necessarily be doing if the circumstances of Gibraltar were not as they are. They are, and we have to be ambitious to ensure that we go as far as we can in building this nation of ours.
Now, there is you've mentioned that we published a drawing about what could or could not be done. But you see, there is a public perception that the GFA appear to be hiding something. And it may not be a secret in so far that UEFA has been telling the GFA that they cannot build anything at the Victoria Stadium site, not because the stadium may not fit that site, but precisely because they feel that it is disputed land. In other words, they are taking the Spanish political point of view. Now, right, let them take whatever view they may wish to take, but the GFA is a Gibraltar institution, and therefore they should be supportive of the Gibraltar point of view. For example, Gibraltar starts at the frontier and ends at Europa Point, and therefore within that area we can build a stadium wherever we like. We don't have to be told by UEFA where we can or where we cannot, especially if there are political undertones, which there are. So therefore, what do you say about building on the Victoria Stadium site? If that is possible, and we're given sufficient explanations, which we have not by the GFA.
Joe, I know that you don't miss a word of what is said in Parliament, and your question is not dissimilar to one of the issues that we discussed last time. Let me give you the answer that I gave Parliament so that those who weren't listening, like I'm sure you were, understand what the position of the government of Gibraltar is, which is almost exactly the same as yours. The position of the government is that Gibraltar starts at the frontier with Spain and ends not at Europa Point, but in the middle of the Straits. And I know that's exactly what your view is too. And therefore, if anybody were to put the view to the government that it is not possible to develop a stadium anywhere on Gibraltar because of a particular political problem with Spain, then that would be completely unacceptable to us. And if there were a better site, whether that is, let's say it, on the isthmus or not, well, that would not be an issue for the government of Gibraltar, and we would insist on that particular site. The issues, as far as I am concerned, in relation to the Victoria Stadium, have nothing to do with the isthmus or Spain. I specifically asked the UEFA representative whether this was the issue that was driving them towards Europa Point. They told me specifically to my face that it was not, and I understood from what they told me what the logistical issues that they were putting about the Victoria area were. Those I think I've explained, with the multi-use facility, they're having to demolish part of the Tercentenary Hall, and the issues with Bayside and the other schools using the area. Stephen is not wrong that if you were to have a holistic approach to the redevelopment of the area of Bayside, you might see yourself moving the school, moving the stadium, etc. That sort of project, which would engage the government in creating a new comprehensive somewhere else, or changing the configuration of the comprehensive, might be possible. But that is not a project which we can undertake in anywhere near sort of the time frame that GFA are looking at, or indeed that the government would be able to finance. I mean, the government has to deliver its manifesto commitments. It cannot build a new comprehensive school at this stage, although it may be an issue for the future. But for me, any political argument about the territorial extent of Gibraltar and Spain's attitude to it is something which belongs in the rubbish bin and not to be given serious consideration when looking at the location of the new stadium.
I was going to go on to something else, but just on the last one on that. So reclamation, if we were more patient, might not be altogether something to throw out.
Well, look, there is the possibility of reclamation involving rugby and cricket, but again, the area that we're looking at for rugby and cricket doesn't have the sort of access that you would need for this sort of facility, because for rugby and cricket, we're looking at a different sort of facility, not a stadium. Different access considerations apply. The only place that you could reasonably, from the advice I have, reclaim further in order to develop the stadium would be on the east side. I'm advised that we are now on the limits of where you can reclaim land. You may still be able to do some marina work, but where you can reclaim land without having transboundary effect to Spain. So Spain continually argue that we have reclaimed on the eastern side beyond the areas where we could, A, because it's their water, B, because it would have transboundary effect on them. The advice we have is we haven't reached that stage up to the limit where we are now. But if we go further, we would have to consult with the Spanish government about reclaiming on the eastern side of Gibraltar to build a stadium. Look, I don't think that would fit anybody's time frame. In my lifetime, I doubt whether we'd get the letter approving it.
Talking